I lasted till about 2:30 and 2:30 in the afternoon of reshuffle day, which I thought, I might be okay. But then, you hear the word go and meet him in his office behind the speaker's chair, and that's the that's the exit
That's
strategy.
bad news.
That's the bad news. Yeah, but very nicely done, very charming.
So Bob Neill, Conservative MP for Bromley and Chislehurst, welcome to your exit interview. First question, I suppose, as always, is why are you leaving?
I've had a good run. I've done a lot of great things, but I've just taken the view that after that time, and having just clocked over to what, suppose I'd become a judge, or I'd just be coming up towards retiring age. But more to the point, as some of you know, because I've talked about it quite openly, my wife, Anne Louise, had a stroke 4 years ago, and I think it's got to the stage where she deserves more of my time. She's been there for me in the past. About time I was there for her more. Got lots of plans for the future. And finally, the boundaries changed in the constituency. Put that lot together, and it seemed a sensible time.
It's interesting. One of the things that's come up again and again in this series is people talking about the impact being an MP has on family life and the ability to be there, whether it's raising children or looking after parents or spouses or whatever. Have you felt that as well?
Yes, well, it didn't do much for my first marriage, Matt. But Anne Louise and I have been together for a while now, and she was a great support, but it does make a problem. And I think it would have been harder if I had perhaps had a younger family and kids. That's not the issue. Our kids are grown up. But that could have been harder, I think. And I think it's a real worry going forward. I think a lot of bright people who will be ideal in Parliament are put off by that and by lots of other things, which we could talk about as well, the general attitude and nature of political debate.
It's interesting. Now, what could we do then to make it more appealing to young professionals, essentially, to want to go into politics? It feels like there was a time, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, talking about making it more family-friendly, changing the hours and all that. And actually, it feels like more than ever, people are saying, it's cost me my marriage, I haven't seen my children growing up, I've got parents, I've got whatever it is. The impact on people's families seems to be getting worse almost.
I think it is. And I think the hours, as you rightly say, Matt, are only a part of it. It's a bit of that. I think the real problem, though, is that, I hate to say it, as a society, I think it's a message to the public, really, we're pretty schizophrenic in what we want of our MPs. On the one hand, we say, look, we want people who are going to be in touch with ordinary folk, in touch with the world as it is, but then we expect them to live a lifestyle that makes that almost impossible. The hours are part of that, but it's also, I think, the huge amount, and I think increasing amount of work that comes in through the constituency caseload, the 24-hour news cycle. Just the demands have grown more and more and more, and the actual sitting hours in Parliament are a comparatively straightforward part of that to handle. It works for me because I can get back home every night down to Chislehurst. But a lot harder if you're up in the north of England and then you are literally living away from your family. But I think it's also the attitude that I'm afraid that public debate has taken on now, much more aggressive, I'm afraid, much more tribal in tone. You put that package together, and I think we all of us as a society need to think about that. If we want good people in politics, you've got to treat them with at least a bit of respect, even if you disagree with them.
If you were a young man, again, in your 20s or 30s, would you opt for life as an MP?
I got the bug about that time, I suppose. A bit earlier, I think, at sixth form and uni. So I probably would, but if I was advising my younger self, I'd say, look, you can have a very good career as a lawyer, Bob. You can achieve a lot of things there, and you can have a very comfortable living. And I might try and talk my younger self out of it, actually, Matt. But equally, I hope that I wouldn't totally succeed, because we do need good people doing it.
Let's talk about your journey into politics. Like you said, so you first, 1983, you stood for the constituency of Dagenham, where you came close to a win in what had been a Labour seat a long time, Michael Foot and the longest suicide note in history and all of that. You stood 4 times before you actually became an MP. What drove you to want to keep on doing it, to not listen to yourself and go off and make money as a lawyer?
Well, there's a slight factual correction. It was only twice that I stood for Parliament before.
Yeah.
But I had stood for and been elected to the Greater London Council back in the day when Ken Livingstone was still around. I'd been a borough councillor even before Dagenham in Havering, which is just down the road where I grew up. And I, of course, have been on the London Assembly immediately before I became an MP. I think I got fascinated by politics when I was in the sixth form, probably at school. I went to a state selective school. It was sort of grammar school with lathes, workshops is the way I put it, in Hornchurch, London suburb. But we had really great teachers, and I was particularly interested in history and English and economics. And that got me interested in things like our debating society that we had. I did some acting and so on. All of that got me into the idea both of public speaking on the one hand and advocacy, but also I think the history in particular got me into politics because there's a lot of politics in history and vice versa.
So you finally came in 2006 in a by-election. And it's been interesting speaking to, in this series, people who came in by-elections. It's a weird thing because you've had a lot of attention on you that you wouldn't in a general election, but you're not part of a gang. You're not part of the 2001 intake or the 2010 intake or whatever it might be. What was that like for you coming in 2006? Where there was a lot of attention because David Cameron had just become Tory leader, the modernisation thing was happening and all of that, but you're not part of a gang.
It was very odd, actually, Matt. I agree with you. I mean, the by-election itself was pretty bruising, it has to be said, and not particularly pleasant experience, frankly, because for a raft of reasons, we perhaps haven't got time to go into here, it actually was a very personalised campaign by some of the opposition parties. You've covered by-elections. You know how it can get. And I've been around a fair bit in politics already, so I've got a pretty thin skin, but it was still pretty bruising. And particularly then, it may be a bit better now, there wasn't much induction. You're to a degree on your own. The whips were there to make sure you're about and voted, but if it hadn't been for that, it took me ages to get in office, and you really had to sort of pick up the pieces, more or less. My predecessor, Eric's fourth team, were very small. Eric ran it in a, perhaps some might say, slightly old-fashioned way. Didn't do a great deal of constituency casework in a formal fashion. Did a lot on the phone, actually, in Eric's case. I wanted to do it differently, but one of his staff was leaving, so I had to recruit new people and get things up and moving again with not a vast amount of help. But I was lucky compared with some, actually, Matt, because I had lots of people who I knew from those days back in local government and on the Assembly who were already in the House of Commons. So I had friends to go to. But I think a lot of people, if you didn't have that, would have struggled. And you're right, I wasn't actually sort of part of a group. And it took years before they sort of made me an honorary member of the 2025 intake for the purposes of our sort of drinks and get-togethers.
And do you think that affects you? You became a minister in the when the coalition was formed in 2010, and you were there for a couple of years. But do you think that affects then your ability to get on if you're not part of a gang and you haven't got, your cohort, if you like, that you're moving on with?
I think it can do. I don't know whether it did in my case or not. I mean, I got made a shadow minister in 2008 to start with. That was within 2 years of coming into the House. That was I thought, pretty good going, actually. I think what it might have done was it didn't enable me to build those sort of social networks as quickly as you get if you are of that sort of the dining clubs that people talk about, which are nothing like as mysterious as people think, or those other sort of social groups where people are networking a lot, and where I saw, the 2010 intakes, 2015 intakes being pretty ferocious about doing that. It is the networking, really. So you're a little bit more out on that. It probably meant that I was typecast by what I was known as, which was in those days as a local government person, which got me the job quickly, but possibly also meant that they didn't see other places where I might have moved on to. So
you then, having, I was going to say step down, you were sacked as a minister.
Very politely and very charmingly by David Cameron, but he did a bit of a cull, if you remember, Matt.
Yes.
Of virtually anyone who was a junior minister and had clocked over 60.
Yes.
Unless they were obviously going to get into the cabinet. Which
This is the sort of the war, the white male and pale and stale.
I'm afraid it was.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I ticked those boxes, and so David did that. I lasted till about 2:30 o'clock and 2:30 in the afternoon of reshuffle day, which I thought, I might be okay. But then, you hear the word, go and meet him in his office behind the speaker's chair, and that's the that's the exit
That's
strategy.
bad news.
That's the bad news. Yeah, but very nicely done, very charming. And then the next day he rang me up. As I said, if I can continue to help, I will. He rang me up and said, would I be vice chairman of the party? So he got a bit of me back for free.
For free, you went without pay. So then it was then in 2015 you became chair of the Justice Select Committee, which obviously with your legal background, and you've been there for 9 years, so sort of longer than anything. What do you prefer, being a minister, sort of junior minister, or chairing the Select Committee?
In the overall picture of things, although being a junior minister was fun, great, it's great to have the T-shirts, great to see things from the inside. I think actually we got quite a bit done in those early days of the coalition. Nonetheless, the chance to have a good run at a subject that I've spent my whole life, professional life in, was great. And that's got to be the best thing I've done in politics by a long way.
And having watched it so closely as the chair of the Select Committee for so long, what state is the justice system in 2024?
Not good. And that's not a criticism of current justice ministers, least of all Alex Chalk, the current Lord Chancellor. I think is very, very, very good indeed. But it's in a bad way because governments of all parties haven't invested in it for decades. And going back to the time before I was in the House, when I was still, a full-time barrister doing my local government on the side, if you like. The Labour government never invested in it. Under Blair, it hadn't been invested in almost even before that. And I tell you why, because it's not regarded as being politically sexy. There aren't enough votes in it, and therefore it's always going to get knocked back down the priority list after education and health and social care. But ultimately, a lot of the things that put pressure on the justice system, are things that have gone wrong earlier. Chunk of the people who come through, and this is purely criminal justice, people who come through the criminal justice system are there because of things that have gone wrong by other state agencies, in education, in family breakdown, the care system, mental health, in education, lack of literacy, numeracy, all those things can make people vulnerable to getting into crime. But in fact, those protected departments, as we put it in political terms, their failures are being picked up by the justice system, which doesn't have that same financial protection because it doesn't get the same political headlines.
It's interesting. I take your point about governments of all colours, but we have had certainly a Prime Minister of the same colour for the last 14 years, although obviously not the same person. What's happened to the party of law and order? That you've got, the prisons are at breaking point. The courts are both falling down physically and gummed up in terms of cases. It's not a great record after 14 years in power, is it?
It could be a lot better. But I think that's been for a raft of reasons. I'm not one of those people who's going to say that it's all because of the pandemic. No, it's not. But that did make it worse. There's no question of that. I think the turnover of justice secretaries has been a real problem, that there wasn't the continuity. I think there has been a problem in the way it's perhaps a consequence, if I can put it this way, of the change in the nature of the Lord Chancellor and the Justice Secretary, going back to actually Charlie Faulkner's time, and when Derry Irvine went in Tony Blair's time, and you had the new style Lord Chancellor, which is a much less significant political beast.
Yeah.
And there was a time when being Secretary of State for Justice and Lord Chancellor was the destination job. That was as far as you were going to go. Because you were in the Lords, you couldn't really go any further. But you had a lot of clout around that. Probably the last really big beast who was coming into it like that was Ken Clarke. But Ken was let down, I think, by the horse trading for money in the coalition government. He never got as much money, I think, as he was initially promised. And then you had, frankly, the experiment with non-lawyer Lord Chancellors, which I think did not end well, and therefore it never got the level of leverage which you can get as a cabinet minister. And therefore it never got enough funding, frankly. When the arguments about cutting up the size of the budgetary cake were there, the position of Justice Secretary and as Lord Chancellor didn't have the same clout that perhaps it might have done in the past.
But it's weird, isn't it? Because you've got, on the one hand, the Conservatives, the sort of lock them up, prison works argument, but then not having anywhere to lock them up. There aren't enough prison places. The ones that there are massively understaffed, under-resourced, in need of refurbishment. And you're right, we can say with all these things, well, it's not sexy or there's no votes in it, but sometimes governments have to do what government's jobs are.
Absolutely. And that's why I think there's it's the classic symptom of a wider problem that when we got into this issue with the protected as opposed to non-protected departments, because that plus the very siloed nature of the way government works in the UK anyway made it really hard to take a joined-up view about a problem which, and I say again, we're purely talking on the criminal side at the moment, say a lot more about civil justice and family justice, for example, but actually where the issues run across a whole load of departments and therefore pots of spending. And we've never had a proper system in the UK, in all my time in politics, actually to look at the way we pool financing. Local government is actually better at it than central government, funnily enough.
And obviously the chopping and changing, not just of Justice Secretaries, but Prime Ministers has played a part in that as well. So, Bob, we were just talking about the state of the criminal justice system, which you've been following as chairman of the Justice Select Committee. I suppose to some extent the blame for lots of the issues falls to your bosses over the years. When you came in as a Conservative MP in 2006, David Cameron was your boss. Sum up David Cameron in a word for us.
I think a man of real substance, and I think Cameron is a class act. I remain a Cameron fan. I think it's a tragedy that things went wrong in the referendum. If it hadn't been for that, I think David had the ability and I think the understanding to be a really significant Prime Minister. I think, in fact, having made the comments I made earlier about the pressures and maybe the errors we made about protected and non-protected, when you look at it in the round, I think that coalition government was actually very successful, given the situation it inherited. I actually found that the way it worked between the two parties was actually surprisingly constructive in most cases. Certainly was.
It was a bit more professional, wasn't it? Rather than briefing to the papers. The two sides got together every week and sorted things out.
And actually, that concentrated minds, and actually, I think it brought out the best in people, and it kept some of the inevitably less attractive tendencies that you have in all party politics had to be put to be one side of it, and that was for the better, I think.
David Cameron, a class act. Theresa May, in a word.
One of the most well-intentioned and I think moral people I have come across in politics. As a person, I think she's utterly admirable. I like her. I've known Theresa going back to when we were both active in local government and the voluntary side of the party. I admire her very much. I think, unfortunately, she wasn't able to develop and call on the skill sets that were necessary to deal with an increasingly ungovernable party at the time that she came in. And I think actually she made a tactical error in attempting to oversell herself to the Brexiteer end of the party. If because she was concerned that she'd be seen as a Remainer and therefore couldn't deliver on Brexit, I think she tacked too hard at the very beginning. Yeah, I think actually if she had come in straight away and said we are going to have to negotiate an agreement, a type of an association agreement, which might have been involved much closer economic and other links with the EU, she could have delivered it then, but she boxed herself in, and I think possibly she didn't have good advice, particularly in that first part of the term, because some of her closest aides, I don't think, were giving her the best advice. So a shame, because I think she was a totally honourable person, but it didn't work out for her.
Honourable person, but it didn't work out for her. What about Boris Johnson? Honourable person?
I think I made my view pretty clear.
You were one of those. You were one of those who put in the letter of no confidence against Boris Johnson.
I did, and I make no bones of that. But I've had friendly relations with Boris. Got on well with Boris when he was mayor, when I was the local government minister, when I was vice chairman. We worked well together, and he's a man of very considerable talents. But at the end of the day, I'm afraid the person who brought Boris down was Boris himself, because he lacked, I regret to say, the self-discipline and I think the sense of seriousness at the end of the day that's necessary to do the job, which is a contrast with Cameron, who actually I think had both. He was fortunate he's in his opponent in 2019, and thank God he won in 2019, because a Jeremy Corbyn government would have been worse. But at the end of the day, I'm afraid Boris failed to come up to the mark of the serious job of being Prime Minister, I'm sorry to say.
Well, luckily, it was all much more serious and sensible with Liz Truss. Sum up Liz Truss in a word.
It was brief, and that's probably for the best.
Very good. So now we come to Rishi Sunak. The guy, it's sort of fallen to him to clean up this mess. Wasn't chosen by the members. He's faced nothing he's done in the last, however long it is, 18 months, has shifted the dial. Sum up Rishi Sunak for us.
I think a thoroughly good guy who's been dealt a really, really tough hand by the people who went immediately before him. I've huge sympathy for Rishi. I think he's got the intellectual ability, he's got the work ethic, he's actually got the right ethical approach to things. He's a genuine and straight guy. I must say, if people met him personally, he's also a very charming and very nice guy. But he's, I think, been dealt a hand where it's very, very hard indeed for him to try and turn it round. Again, I think maybe if I was saying to Rishi anything, I'd say, well, you can't please everybody within a fractious party. Remember that it's that important, moderate, pragmatic majority of the Conservative members of Parliament, and I think ultimately of our members, that supported you to get there. Don't feel the need to please everyone, because there are some people who will never be reconciled and will never be willing to help you, whatever they might say. And so stick to your guns, do the right thing by the country, rather than trying to keep everybody happy.
I wonder whether the prospect of, if the polls are to be believed, Conservatives going into opposition, whether you'll be quite glad not to be a Tory MP under, say, Suella Braverman as leader.
Well, I made my mind up to go, and I'm not going to try and be too much of a backseat commentator. The only thing that might make me want to stay in opposition, depending on what happens, is to make sure that the Conservative Party, if it were to lose, and I don't think that's a given at all, we've got a long way to go yet, and I shall be out supporting my successor in the constituency to hold the seat for the Conservatives, and I hope that we do get a Conservative majority. But what will be the worst thing from my perspective is all my life, I've been my adult life, I've been a Conservative. I've been a member of the Conservative Party for over 50 years now. Always a Conservative, never a hardliner, never a right-winger. I'm a politician of the centre-right, and centre and right are both of equal importance as far as I'm concerned. It will be a tragedy, and I think a disaster for both the party and the country, if we were tempted to forget about the centre part of the equation and move too far to the right. And, if I were there, I'd be fighting hard against that.
Because I suppose it's what happens, isn't it? You see with the Labour Party, when they go into opposition, they run off to the left before they come back to the centre. The Conservative Party does have a habit of lurching to the right before seeing sense. What will happen? What would happen to the Conservative Party if Suella Braverman or Priti Patel is leader of the Conservatives?
Well, if it lurched to the right, we'd end up being in opposition for longer. It's as simple as that, and you've only got to look at history. We did the same thing after 1997, and we wasted years going around in ideological circles before actually reality dawned, and Michael Howard steadied the ship, and David Cameron came through, and we became electable again. We managed to toxify ourselves, and it took a long time to detoxify ourselves. I hope common sense would say, don't do that again, because Keir Starmer, a perfectly reasonable guy on a personal level, is not Tony Blair. A Labour government, if it were to come in, would be imminently beatable by a sensible, refreshed, centrist, pragmatic Conservative Party. that's what I say. Don't forget that. So that's what I say.
Just finally, then, I suppose the final question to ask you to exit interview, Bob Neill, is what will you do next?
Well, I'm looking at various things, Matt, because I'm actually only 72 in June, but that's after a good run. That's fair enough to do things, but a bit more slowly. And I'm looking to do some things around that interface of law and politics. I've was a lawyer most of my life. Perhaps once you're a lawyer, you stay a lawyer. So I'm looking to do some things in that sphere. So I've got a few irons in the fire, and always happy to come and talk to friends on the media as well.
Very good. Well, we look forward to that. Bob Neill, thanks so much for joining us on your exit interview.
Pleasure. Thanks very much, Matt.